Moving back towards financial resilience and being prudent as required under the Act. They are the four keystones we've gone back to. If I turn to the levers, the funding levers we have, in particular starting at the bottom of page 9, the first lever we talk to within the body of the report is around the capital release. And the comment there, to access sufficient funds to meet expenditure requirements while at the same time complying with our need for prudence, financial resilience and intergenerational equity, the decision was made to consult on selling part of the investment portfolio held by CCHL. So that's the first lever there. What I wanted to point out is that the process in this is as important, in my opinion, as the potential quantum. And that is set out on page 10 and is also referenced, I've noted in the Mayor's recommendation as well. From about the third paragraph down is the description around the process that would be followed there. The proposed rates increases at the bottom of page 10, they are looking to set rates increases over the long term, which remain within financially sustainable limits, and hold rate increases over the next 3 years as low as practicable, given the balance that is required. That's looking to stay within sustainable limits. The graphs that follow on page 12 to 14 show the profile of the proposed solution across the various aspects of rates over the 30-year profile, how borrowing projected debt would move, the impacts on projected net debt to revenue ratio, and one element that goes to affordability, which is the net interest to rates ratio. As well as providing a recommendation, there are alternative options which are shown as well. The purpose of the alternative options is to show what happens with different combinations of pulling on the various funding levers, and those are shown starting from page 15. They are a reasonable subset of how the funding levers can be pulled, but obviously there's a myriad of options available within any one of those. The main aspects that have been looked at is if there were less asset sales, what is the impact on the other levers such as higher rates? If there were higher rates, how would that impact on lower net debt to revenue ratio? And so that's the financial resilience aspect. I don't intend to go through the alternative options. They are there for information and also to be considered. I wanted to talk about section 6 and quantified limits just to avoid confusion around it. One of the legislative requirements for us is to produce quantified limits on rates increases and borrowings, and it follows a distinct definition and requirement under the Act. As such, it can look like it doesn't match with the other rates increases that we've put through for existing ratepayers. So to be non-confused, I would suggest that people look at the previous rates figures rather than the quantified limits. Quantified limits allow the benchmarks to be done by government across the industry, but they will be confusing for current ratepayers. And my final summary point is to look at the graph on page 20, which even since published is now out of date, with Wellington having resolved to consult last night on their rates increases. We've had a very preliminary look at what that would do to the Wellington profile, and it would have, within this time frame, have Wellington ending at exactly the same point as we are. So we will have to update the information around that, and we intend to as further councils come out. What this graph is showing is that we are moving through from being very low against the benchmarks through to middle and about the middle of the plan, and what it will show is the same as Auckland at the end and below Auckland but above the others. And I think that's a point that is worth considering and noting as we work through consideration of the financial strategy. I'll now pass over to Chris Gregory for a quick run through on the infrastructure strategy.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Peter. As Peter mentions, the infrastructure strategy is a new document for council. It came about as part of the legislation changes about 6 months ago. Previously, we were required to have asset management plans for each individual asset group. Now under that legislation change, we're required to provide this 30-year view of 5 items or 5 core items of infrastructure, being the 3 waters: water supply, wastewater and stormwater. We're also expected to include in here the flood control measures and protection works, and roads and footpaths. So they are the 5 areas that are specified in legislation have to be covered by this document. And so that is why there is nothing, that's why that has focused on what is seen as the core assets for council in terms of infrastructure. It links to the asset management plans that underpin those particular asset groups. So there are still asset management plans for all asset groups, including these 5. And this document is really a summary of the things that are being coming to the fore in those individual asset management plans. So there's the linkage in terms of the detailed asset management planning coming into this document as a summary document, giving a high-level overview for council of those core asset groups. Previously, asset management plans have only been required to cover 10 years. This one is required to cover 30 years. So we're looking out to 2045, and that does bring in a whole new set of parameters in terms of looking out that far and the things that we've had to consider in putting this document together for you. It looks at what's needed for that infrastructure and tries to paint a picture of the challenges, issues and risks that are facing council over that time frame. For this particular document, it's not just the normal day-to-day infrastructure issues that you would expect in terms of capacity for growth and so on. We've had obviously some unique things that we've had to take account in here, and they're identified within the document in terms of earthquake legacy, the new built environment, the residual condition of the networks and so on, and the period of time that it's going to take to completely rebuild the city. Climate change is going to come in, is going to start to impact over this period, so that's an emerging issue that's identified in the document. Urban development and the LERP, and what the LERP has done in terms of the growth and resettlement patterns for Christchurch. So while we have the LERP, we've had to make some assumptions in here in terms of providing infrastructure to support that resettlement and growth, where that might happen and what infrastructure is going to be provided as identified through the models that the teams run to predict where that growth might happen and what infrastructure is needed to support it. And the last point, and I'll come back to this a bit later in a couple of minutes, is ageing infrastructure. We are faced with the fact that in the 50s and 70s, there were big 1950s and 1970s, not 2050 and 2070, there were big building booms. Christchurch grew quite a lot, as did quite a lot of New Zealand through that period. A lot of that infrastructure that was put in to support that growth is now coming to the end of its life. A lot of that infrastructure has expected lives of 80 to 100 years, some of it a bit less than that. And that's coming to its end of its life. When it gets to the end of its life, like any asset, the only option is to basically replace it, because it is far more expensive to just keep trying to maintain it and patch it. It comes to the point where we have to replace pipes or replace roads or footpaths or whatever the asset is. So that's an issue that is really highlighted through this document. So in terms of the document itself, it's split into several sections. Those sections, the front end, and these sections have been highlighted to us through the Auditor General's office. They've given some guidance about the sort of things that they would expect an infrastructure strategy to cover, and we followed that guidance in the layout of this document. So you will see as you read it, there's the background to the district and its communities and so on. Section 2 then goes on to describe what infrastructure we actually have that's covered by this document, so how many kilometres of pipe, etc. 3 provides the context around the linkage of this document to the other documents, and as Peter's already said, this is a core document to support the financial strategy. It will link to the asset management plans and the activity management plans, the consultation document, and the significance policy. So the whole lot form a group of linked documents that in effect provide the LTP and support the long-term plan. And Section 3 describes those linkages. Section 4 is about Council's strategic direction in terms of community outcomes and the linkages that are provided for in the asset management plans by this approach to infrastructure and how it will support those community outcomes. Then 5 goes on to describe in more detail for each of the asset groups some of those issues that are facing infrastructure over the 30-year period. So the things I mentioned before in terms of climate change, etc., how those issues are going to impact the individual groups of assets such as water or flood control. And finally, Section 6 is the financials. And if I can refer you to page 33, there's 3, so the financial section, Section 6, there's a summary graph on page 33, and then there's some summary graphs in that Section 6 for each of the asset groups talked about. And that's page 29, if you, in the landscape version document, and page 33 in the portrait version document. There are 2 appendices. The first one is quite important, or should note that the first appendix, Appendix A, is the detail of the financials for each of the asset groups, and they're at 2015 values. But we've also included in Appendix B a cost-inflated version of that, showing the inflation over the full 30-year period. We decided to do both of those because if we apply the inflation to the numbers and only provide those, then you can't see the trends in terms of increased kilometres of pipes and so on and so forth. That's the reason for the 2 appendices. But Appendix B really gives alignment to the financial strategy in terms of the cost-inflated numbers. So just returning quickly to the graph on page 33, you'll see there towards the end of this 10-year plan, the capital requirement increases quite significantly. The reasoning, or the reason for that, is this ageing infrastructure I talk about. We have a huge increase in the amount of pipe network that we estimate will need to be replaced from about 2025 onwards, and that is ongoing for several years as those waves of development come through from the 50s and 60s, come through to requiring replacement in that 10 to 15 year period towards the end of this strategy. So I think that's that's a very useful graph in terms of a summary, because it really does show what the impact is over a 30-year period or a 30-year view of the issues that are facing council in terms of infrastructure, and particularly in that area of asset replacement in the year 10 to year 25 sort of period. So that's the infrastructure strategy. And I don't have any more detail to go through today on that, unless there are any particular questions or...
Well, yeah, I just kind of wanted to kick that off, because I think the infrastructure strategy is something that is, I mean, really the financial strategy and the infrastructure strategy are the 2 most important underpinning documents. So when we develop the consultation document, we really are going to have to highlight some of these issues quite explicitly. And I guess the one that I've got questions around relate to flood protection and control works. And so page 28, and also on page 37. This is the landscape version, so I'm not sure if I've got the right page. But I mean, just looking at the bottom of page 37, the stormwater management plans also cover flood protection and provide sufficient detail to feed into the capital program. The overall confidence in these financial estimates is low, and that worries me a lot. And then going back to page 28, the projects to be taken under the land drainage recovery program are still being developed and prioritised. There is a large amount of uncertainty about the $627 million budget. for the program. The actual costs may be as low as 400 million through optimising the program, which means only doing stuff that's essential. It's not actually getting an optimal outcome. I don't know that I like the word optimising in that context. I've got used to it with the SCIRT program. And only undertaking those projects with the greatest benefit, or as high as 1.2 billion if all recommended projects are carried out regardless of benefit. So I think that you've highlighted, and this is the role of the document, the biggest area of risk that the city faces.
That is correct. I mean, the reason why the estimates are low is obviously there's still a lot of work being undertaken in terms of the land drainage recovery plan to fully understand the impacts of the land settlement and what that has on the catchment areas and what the best solution is for dealing with that impact. Plus, as I mentioned before, we have to start taking into cognizance now the climate change impacts. So that's not just sea level rise, that's increased rainfall and so on, what that may have. So at this stage, as we work through the land drainage recovery plan, right now with our confidence in terms of the financial estimates are as good as they can be at this stage. And there is a lot of work gone into those, but there is still quite a lot of refinement to occur in that area.
But essentially 627 million is what we're putting on budget, and it could be as high as 1.2 billion.
That's the indication from the current set of estimates, yes.
Yeah, Pauline.
Oh, thank you. Just talking about infrastructure and renewals. When we build new infrastructure now, what is the life expectancy? Is it now higher than the, what did you say, 60 to 80 years?
No, I mean, in terms of UPVC pipe and so on that we would be using for sewers and so on, it's a similar sort of lifespan. It's looking at the 70 to 80 year lifespan for those sort of materials. I mean, It could be engineered to have a longer life, but it wouldn't be cost effective.
Okay, I thought it was. And just a question on the cycleways. I've on page 43 there in the roads and footpaths, of course cycleways are included in that. With our NZTA subsidies in the government's urban cycleways program, when can we get an idea of how much we can reduce our costings for our cycleways through those subsidies? Because there could be considerable savings there, possibly up to 75%, I believe. Because we're still building in the total cost of the cycleways at the moment.
What page are you on, Pauline?
Oh, page 43 of the landscape.
Yeah, 43.
That's
No.
the original version. So I'm just wondering why we got the landscape one this morning too. It's quite confusing. Is this the same as the one we've had? Is everything in here the same
Yes.
that we got this morning? Okay.
Yes.
So on the original one, page 43,
It's page 39 of the landscape.
Yeah.
they were still budgeting for, it says in here, 148 million. I thought it was more like 156, but we could have savings up to 75% of that.
So this is the expenditure process. So the difference between the 156 million, which we have reported to council in various papers recently, that is still the full cost, estimated cost of the major cycleway network.
Yep.
There's $8 million this year, so that's the reason for the difference between the two numbers. The number that's in this document is the
Starts in
expenditure
next
within the
financial
10 year. And that is the expenditure. The funding issue is I guess, a different issue. So that's the total cost of those. As we heard from NZTA 2 weeks ago, the Urban Cycleways Fund, the special fund, is starting to come through, and they are developing parameters for using that for approving contributions from that fund to our program. And there's $100 million available over the first 3 years, I believe, from that fund nationally. They've indicated what we may be able to expect locally from that fund. Similarly from NZTA, qualifying projects could get around about 50% funding assistance if they qualify to the NZTA criteria. But it will depend very much when we get down to the detail of each project, how much funding assistance they get from those two sources. In terms of the alignment to the Urban Cycleway Fund objectives, so those national objectives, and how well each cycleway aligns with those objectives, and they've outlined to us that they will have a moderation process to sit down and consider that, and then decide what percentage of that particular project they will contribute to from that fund. Similarly with NZTA, some elements of each cycleway will not qualify for funding from NZTA because they take the transport view. So if there's some of the recreation aspects or whatever may not qualify for funding under their rules, so we may only get 70% of the project funded at 50%. So it's quite variable, but I think in the funding side of the statements, the financial strategy, there has been assumption made about what sort of overall levels of funding we might get in to support that major cycleways program.
All right, so at the moment that's another unknown, pretty much.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
would we have a timeline of when we might know that? Is it 1 year, 2 years, 10 years?
Or do we
require
apply
us-
each year on a case-by-case basis?
It's by case basis. We have to make an application for each section of each project. With
Yeah,
a supporting
it's not even an
business
entire
case.
project, it's section by section. But I think Pauline's point is that the cost to the ratepayer won't be the total amount that's shown here. It will be reduced by whatever we're able to successfully claim by way of contribution from either of or both of those funds.
And potentially quite significantly.
Potentially quite significant contributions.
I think it's certainly realistic to expect a reasonable proportion of those costs to be funded from the two other funds, yes.
I think that's right too. So thank you for raising that, Pauline. Paul?
Just probably one other concern which I don't see reflected in the document, and that's aside from maybe the shortfall and the potential flood risks in the future, is potential other major seismic events happening over the next 30 years. And I don't know how we actually budget for that, aside from the headroom we may have in there, but another major seismic event would actually have a massive impact on the council.
I suppose we address that, or we do address that issue within the document in terms of our resilience and how we approach resilience. So identifying core assets that are essential for lifeline routes and supporting groups of communities and building resilience as best we can into the services that provide those lifeline routes and those services such as water and wastewater to those core communities. As you say, there are a wide range of events that could happen. The only way that we can approach each one of those is to agree between the asset groups where we need to build resilience to still be able to maintain core services in any one of those events. And so that's what we have graded the assets in that way when we've looked at this in terms of our approach to renewals. Core assets, ones that support lifeline routes and so on, we've taken less of a risk approach towards when they need to be renewed. You could push that out, but that obviously increases the level of risk in terms of resilience.
Phil?
My question is also in relation to hazards, and like you've got reference, Chris, to the sea level rise, and just really about the cost in the event of our aquifers being polluted, either by way of say saltwater infiltration of the aquifers, or in the event of say the aquifer near the airport in the northwest, for that being polluted by way of oil or spill or that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering, and it's not in the document, I didn't expect it, but in terms of future costs, have we got any estimated costs, say, of a system where, for example, we had to treat water from the Waimakariri as an alternative source of water supply?
We haven't tried to cost that. In terms of the aquifers and management of the aquifers, we realise that in the coming years we need to better understand how they perform, and the best protection for those aquifers is some demand management in terms of managing those aquifers so that salt water doesn't get effectively sucked into them by overdrawing on the resource.
So, thanks, Chris. So in effect, that's sort of like an unknown cost at the moment. And
Correct.
Thank you.
Vicky?
Can I just clarify? You outline in here the absolute importance of the groundwater aquifer, and just how we need to mitigate any risk whatsoever to that in Christchurch. Does this document then feed into every other part of the council?
This document is links into the different strategies. So particularly in terms of what we're talking about here, the water supply strategy or the water strategy. So that will look in detail at what is council's strategy in terms of water supply. And this document has really reflected the recommendations and actions that are coming through from that strategic document.
So the idea that we would take any risks with those aquifers will actually be driven into the council organisation. The idea that we wouldn't take any risks with those aquifers.
Correct. That would be dealt with in terms of what is council's strategic approach going to be
Right
through the
throughout
water
the
strategy to
organisation.
water supply, and protecting that water supply.
Good. And last question on the climate change estimate of sea level rise. Given that we've gone for 1 metre in the district plan, I'm assuming we would look to that same figure in here.
That would, I assume, I'm not part of that work, but I would assume we would take that into account when we're doing the modelling for the land drainage recovery programme. Yes.
Paul?
Just on the aquifers, it is my understanding the aquifers will run dry by the year 2041 if we continue our consumption at the rate we are at the moment. So with that in mind, if we're looking at a 2045, there'd have to be some assumption around us actually purifying water source somewhere.
There are several ways of managing the aquifers, and certainly some form of demand management is something that will guarantee that supply or protects that supply for longer. But I think the understanding exactly of the performance of those aquifers and their capability is the confidence of that is not high at present, and we do need to understand that better as we look to the next 30 years and what we can and can't use from those.
Hang on just a minute, because I think Mike Teelan would like to make a comment.
Our current water supply strategy doesn't anticipate any exhaustion of our current aquifer, our current water capacity. In fact, some of the more recent trending data suggests that we may have greater capacity than we've previously planned for. I don't think that changes the fact that actually effective demand management is something we should be aiming for, but there's no absolute risk or loss of water to the council that we can anticipate.
Yep. Yanni? Oh, sorry, Paul, I interrupted you. Did that answer your question?
I was just going to say at the end of it, it actually highlights the importance of that aquifer management.
Absolutely.
It absolutely highlights the importance of it.
Yep. Yanni?
Thanks. Several questions, but thank you for the work that you've done on this. I know it hasn't been easy. Page 32, accessible city has now gone up to 250 million. You've got it at 191, so I think there needs to be some explanation as to where those costings have come from. And why.
Sorry, what's the landscape? Oh. Sorry, we've got landscape and you've got portrait. Yes or no? What?
Assumptions and financial risks, roads and footpaths, page 32.
Yeah, but I can't tell what it is on this.